Marxism. Now, you see, the postmodernists were allied with the Marxists, and this is something that's very difficult to understand, because, you see, if you're a postmodernist, one of the things you say is, there's no valid interpretation of the world, because there's so many interpretations. And so then if you're like a coherent postmodernist, you don't get to go and be a Marxist, because Marxism is a coherent single way of looking at the world. And to boil it down really quickly, what the Marxists do is say, well, the best way to look at the world is that there's people who have a bunch of stuff, and there's people who have hardly any, and there's enmity between them. And the reason the people who have stuff is because they've screwed the people who don't have any stuff. It's something like that. And so that's wrong. First of all, it's true sometimes, right? Because things like that are often true sometimes. But it's like, beware of people who offer you single causality theories, right? Like, human interactions are way more complex than mere power dynamics. But anyways, that's the basic Marxist claim. And the original Marxist claim, up until about the 70s, was bourgeoisie and proletariat, right? It was economic, it was working class against capitalists, something like that. And you can kind of have some sympathy for that. If you read something like George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier, written in the 30s, and you read about how those coal miners lived, and how they were, and how terrible and brutally difficult their life was, and how little money they had, and how they suffered brutally at the hands of industrialists, and so on, you might think, hey, it wouldn't be such a bad idea to give the poor damn working class guys a little bit of a political voice. And the original socialists were that, at least in part, was what they were trying to do. And, fair enough, the working class people need a political voice. So, but what happened is that if that got taken to too great an extreme, like it did in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China and everywhere else that it was tried, it turned instantly into something that was so brutal and so totalitarian and so murderous and so racked with deceit and lie and familial betrayal and interfamilial informers. 1 out of 3 people in East Germany was a bloody government informer. Everyone lied all the time. It was like a complete catastrophe. So there's obviously there's some set of constraints with regards to redistributive policies that make the system kick back viciously hard if you push it past some reasonable degree. And we don't know exactly what that is yet. So, but back to the postmodernists. It's like, they made the claim that there's no canonical interpretation of the world, but they're allied with the Marxists. And so you think, well, how can that be? If your damn theory tells you that no interpretation of the world is correct, how can you be a Marxist? It's like, that doesn't work out. It's not coherent. Okay, so then I thought, all right, well, so why are they Marxists? And then you could say, you could give them the benefit of the doubt. You could say, well, they're Marxists because they care about the oppressed. But then I would say, well, wait a sec. If you care about the oppressed in the 21st century, you probably wouldn't be a Marxist, because you'd read your goddamn history and you'd find out what happens to the oppressed if you adopt a Marxist system. And what you find out is, or maybe you care for them like the rulers of Venezuela care for their citizens. The Venezuelan rulers have pretty much, in their benevolence, eradicated obesity as a problem in Venezuela. Yeah, it's not so damn amusing. The average person there has lost 18 pounds. It's like, it's no joke, And that was a rich country. You have to really work hard to make Venezuela dirt poor, right? It has more oil than it knows what to do with. It's like this keeps happening over and over. So I'm not going to buy the postmodernist claim that the reason that they went along with the Marxism, even though their theory says you can't go along with any overarching narrative, is because they felt compassion for the oppressed. I'm not buying that, because it doesn't make sense. Okay, so then what? Well, then what the hell? So you still need an explanation. But I've been thinking about that a lot. So I'm going to read you something from Friedrich Nietzsche. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what was with that guy, but he, there's people you come across in history that you can't believe exist, and he's one of them. Like, Dostoevsky's one, Nietzsche is one, Nikolai Tesla is one. Like, you read about Tesla, you think, Jesus, where the hell did that guy come from? It's like, I mean, it's just impossible that someone like that could exist. We can't understand it. Tesla inventions used to pop into his head, he said, so fast he couldn't write them down, accurate to the angle of the screws that held the machinery together. And he'd go into states where dozens of these inventions would be popping into his head one after the other, and he couldn't write them down fast enough. And I mean, look, he invented the damn AC electric motor, right? And all our electricity runs on his technology. It's like Tesla was a major league guy. And then Nietzsche, it's like back in the 1870, 1860, around there, he was writing about what was going to happen in the 20th century. And that's pretty amazing, right? It's like you're going to write about what's going to happen in the 21st century? It's like, I don't think so. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, but Nietzsche was able to prophesy things that were going to happen 50 years later. And it's just staggering to me that he managed that. He got the psychology right, something like that, the underlying psychology. And one of the things Nietzsche wrote in his notebooks, published as Will to Power, was that one of the things that was going to happen in the 20th century, because of the death of God, that was his explanation, because of the collapse of the underlying Judeo-Christian ethic, that the world would start to oscillate between fascism and between nihilism and something like communism. In fact, he actually called it communism, that would oscillate. And that he said, in roughly 1860, I believe that was about right, that there'd be tens of millions of people killed as a consequence of that in the 20th century. It's just, you know, the bloody CIA couldn't predict that the wall was going to fall in 1989, right? I mean, to predict something like that 30 years before the Russian Revolution is just absolutely beyond comprehension. And he got it right. And then he said something further, which was, maybe it will be worth it because we'll learn something necessary. Well, it happened. It certainly happened, and on a scale that was perhaps even greater than he had envisioned. But whether or not we learned anything from it, well, that's exactly what we're trying to sort out right now. So here's something that Nietzsche wrote. I love this. For that man be delivered from revenge. That is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. What justice means to us is precisely that the world be filled with the storms of our revenge. Thus they speak to each other. We shall wreak vengeance and abuse on all whose equals we are not. Thus do the tarantula hearts vow. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue. And against all that has power, we want to raise our clamor. You preachers of equality, the tyrant mania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambition to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue. It's like, yes. Okay, so now we think infinite number of interpretations, only some of them work. We flip to Marxism and we say, doesn't look like that's one of the ones that works. Then we say, well, what about compassion? And we think, no, you're not going to get away with that because the historical evidence is already in. So then, but we still have the issue. Why postmodernism and Marxism? Why are they joined together? Well, Nietzsche has a suggestion. He said, well, wait a second, just because someone tells you constantly, over and over, as loudly as they possibly can, that there's no one on the planet any more compassionate than they are, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the case. Because it turns out that being compassionate, first of all, is an insufficient moral virtue, because compassion isn't enough of a principle to guide the world by. You need all sorts of other principles, for example, like justice. But also because, well, there's no reason for us to assume that all the compassion is on the sides of the people who are waving the banner for compassion. The world just doesn't arrange itself that way, and it's highly improbable to me that all the genuinely compassionate people who genuinely care about the oppressed all happen to adopt the postmodern doctrine in the 1970s, and they've got like a stranglehold on virtue. It's like, sorry, and the ones I've met, I wouldn't exactly describe as the most virtuous people I've ever run into. Okay, so then we'll unravel it one further degree. It's like, okay, so Nietzsche's claim is, wait a second. So actually, what's happening here is it's just jealousy and resentment. It's the observation that power is not equally distributed in the world, or let's say authority, or let's say competence, because we don't have to just say power. Competence is not distributed equally in the world, and there are people out there who have more authority and who have more competence, and who have more power, and who have more money, and who have more things than me. And that's annoying. Really. Like, it's seriously annoying. You know, one of the oldest stories we have is the story of Cain and Abel. And that's what that story is about. Because Abel has what Cain doesn't. And what Abel has what Cain doesn't. And God tells Cain that the reason Cain doesn't have it is because he just hasn't got his act together properly. And Cain is so annoyed about that answer that he goes and kills Abel. And that's an old story. And it's right. And so when you see these people who are attempting to tear down hierarchies of competence, because I'm not going to say hierarchies of power, then maybe what you think is, no, it's not exactly that you're so compassionate. It's not exactly that you're so much for the people at the bottom. It's that you just hate the people at the top. You hate anybody who has any more than you. And you see this, too, with these kids in Ivy League schools in the United States, for example, who are clamoring about the 1% and how absurd and unfair that is. And I think the Yale students in particular, right, because Yale is a particularly reprehensible institution. And these kids are, first of all, just as a matter of fact, richer than 99.9% of the human beings that live on the planet now and who've ever lived. So the 1% they're talking about is that tiny fraction of people who actually happen to be wealthier than they are. And that's often people who adopt that perspective. That's how they define wealth. Who's wealthy? Well, that's easy. Anyone who has more money than me. Right. So what's the motivation? The motivation is to tear down anything that's hierarchical and to either destroy it just out of sheer spite, or to gather the value that those hierarchies have produced and to take it for themselves. And they use the guise of compassion, which is the most reprehensible possible means of what would you call camouflage, to do that. And so you think, well, is that a credible argument? Well, we're not going with the compassion thing. It's like, no, they're not Marxists out of compassion, because you cannot be a Marxist out of compassion. So, and that goes for all that identity politics rubbish as well. It's the same thing, and it's same old wolf in new sheep's clothing. So it's not compassion. It's jealousy and resentment and spite, and maybe the desire to destroy for the sake of destruction because of that resentment and spite. And if it isn't that, then it's greed, because what they have already, which is plenty, is nowhere near enough. And I see this among university professors, although not only among university professors, obviously. When I talk to them about business people, because, business people have plenty of terrible things to say about university professors, so it goes both ways. But, the university professors that I talk to are often quite negatively predisposed to business people. And because I work for the business school, for example, and some of my colleagues have been not very happy that I've done that. And anyways, the reason I'm telling you that is because it's easy for people who are well situated to look at other people who are well situated but in a different position and even be jealous across that lateral span. It's a very human characteristic. All right, so they're not compassionate. That's not what it is. We're going to say that it's resentment and the desire to destroy. But then we're going to cap that off with one final observation, okay? Because this argument, I don't want this argument to be weak. This has to be a strong argument. It has to rest on many, many different pieces of foundation. So here's the other thing that's cool that I've been thinking about over the last while. One of the things that it's really interesting is that the postmodernists and the identity politics types and the politically correct types are always talking about power, 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 power. And it's curious to me because it's obvious that all human hierarchies and all human relationships are not mediated by power. There's lots of things that mediate relationships. Love mediates relationships. And say one of the things I've noticed about entrepreneurial types in particular, because I know a number of extraordinarily spectacular entrepreneurial types, managerial types for that matter too. One of the things that's really interesting about people like that, if they're the real thing, is like they are so thrilled when they can find someone who's smart and competent that they can help develop. It's like half of what brings them joy. They're just deadly thrilled. It's not like, you're a young guy and you come to me and you've got some possibility and I think, yeah, to hell with you. I'm going to pick your pockets and leave you skeletal in the ditch because that way I'll have more power. It's like that is not how those people behave. They think, wow, you've actually got a clue. Here's some opportunities, man. Have at them. And that's very, very common. You know, and we know that lots of hierarchies are built on competence and not power. I mean, we make that decision all the time. If you're going to have some work done in your house, a plumber, you say, you bring 5 plumbers in. You say, well, how are you going to fix this? And they all tell you, and they give you a price, and you pick the best plumber. You don't pick the plumber with the most bloody power. You know, you pick the plumber who's got the most competence. And we also know, by the way, and we know this, that if you want to predict the success of people in Western cultures, we know what psychological attributes predict success. It's very cool. One is intelligence. That's the biggest predictor. And the other is conscientiousness, which is the willingness to work hard. It's like, in our cultures, smart people who work hard do better. Well, then you might think, so you might think of that as some evidence of validation. If you want the sort of culture where smart people who work hard get ahead, you'd want to see that, in fact, smart people who do work hard get ahead. And that is what you see. So, you know, the system is full of error and there's noise, but those are still the most reliable predictors, so that's really cool. Okay, so back to power. So let's say, there's all these diverse reasons why people arrange themselves in groups and arrange themselves in hierarchies. And the postmodernist, neo-Marxist types say, no, it's all about power. It's oppression and oppressor. That's all it is. And the people who are at the top are oppressing the people at the bottom. It's all about power. It's like, well, no, it's not. That's a stupid perspective. So why the hell would you have that perspective? Well, here's the answer, as far as I can tell. If it's all about power, then I can use power. And that's that. And that's what I see happening. And that goes along with all the other things that I've talked about. It's not only that the compassion is lacking, is that the emphasis is continually on power dynamics. Because if your goal is to tear the damn structure down just out of resentment, or to steal from people who've earned what they had, the best way to justify that from a philosophical perspective is to make the claim that all human relationships are predicated on power, and that immediately justifies your use of power and force to take whatever the hell you want. And I think that desire, that power desire, plus resentment, those are the two things that are driving the unholy alliance of postmodernism and Marxism, and that's what's underneath political correctness. And that's what you need to understand, and that's what we need to stop from happening. So